the reason that humans are so different to other animals is that we aren't just reliant on genetic instincts or what we can learn over our lifetime, but this kind of culturally, socially acquired software running on our hardware. So the human brain hasn't changed all that much in the last few million years. Tripled in size, and then it kind of leveled off at around several 100,000 years ago. And if anything, it's kind of shrunk. But we have gotten clever, and we have gotten clever not because our brains changed, but because the software running on those brains changed. So our ability to reason, our ability to count, all of those mental tools that we have are socially acquired. And so we have nice math for describing how that software evolves, how it is that humans acquire that software, how innovations take place, and it has implications for how we work together. And so as I was kind of putting these pieces together, I realized this is making major shifts within the behavioral sciences. It's moving over into economics. It's moving all into other adjacent sciences, the biological sciences. But a lot of people in the public don't know about it yet. And yet it affects everything about our decisions that we have to make in the coming century.
That reminds me a lot of kind of like the progress studies call that Patrick Collison and Tyler Cohen, I think, put out a few years ago. It's like that same kind of question of how do you optimize for a certain set of conditions, right? Like, how do you optimize society to get you to XYZ place? But before we get into all of that, like your answer for how we do that, can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned climate change earlier. Why you feel that this is kind of the like answering this question is sort of the game changer in terms of where we are in history, because that seems really important as to why you would like dive into this theory in the first place.
Yeah, so that was the starting point. The starting point was that when there were, as economists, when there are shocks to a system, a lot of institutions fail, right? Or there's a big change that can take place. And there were clearly changes that were coming as a result of climate change. So I'll give you an example. When a million Bangladeshis are underwater and they're kind of streaming large number of refugees into India, can India deal with that? Does the infrastructure can it deal with it? Can the institutions deal with it? And I think we saw, most recently at Europe's doorstep, the Syrian migration crisis was a climate change precipitated disaster of the kind that had been commonly happening in Africa, but doesn't really quite make the news until it's at your doorstep, right? So there were droughts. People flooded in from rural areas into cities in order to find jobs. There weren't the jobs for them. The infrastructure couldn't cope, and so people eventually rioted, and you have a refugee crisis. And so that has knock-on effects, right? So when you have a million people at your door, this isn't an ideal case where you can design a wonderful immigration policy. It's a humanitarian case, and you deal with it as best you can. But it's like guests turning up in your house, and you haven't bought enough groceries. Are you going to be able to tackle that problem, right? And so when you put people under resource constraints, everything becomes more difficult. It becomes more difficult to govern them, and this can lead to feedback loops where everything becomes a little bit more challenging. Alongside that, Emma, one of the big puzzles that I work on is the puzzle of large scale cooperation of the kind that we see in the modern world. So we're doing this as a podcast, but we could have been in the same room. And you might take that for granted, but it's a very strange thing, actually. Like, if from a cross species perspective, if we were, four chimps, we'd be kind of four dead and maimed chimps. It's kind of weird from a historical perspective. If this was a few hundred years ago, we're from very different places. Like, it would be a threatening situation, and even geographically today, there are some places that are much safer than others. So the question is, how did that happen? And the answer seems to be that there's a cooperation goes hand in hand with excess energy availability. And when we discovered millions of years worth of stored sunlight in the ground during the Industrial Revolution, thanks to cheap and available coal, we were able to use that to kind of supercharge, human ingenuity. And it created a positive sum world where it incentivized people working together to do great things, build an internet, engage in massive innovation, but also terrible things like, colonization and wars of conquest. So when those things were hand in hand, that was great. We had this huge energy explosion, but we're facing a slightly different situation today, particularly since the 1970s, where the numbers, both artificially thanks to OPEC, but also in reality, energy availability is kind of decreasing. So in the book, what I call the space of the possible, which is created by our energy ceiling and the innovations and technological efficiencies, is shrinking on us. And so that, alongside all of these crises and just increasing number of people, makes everything a little bit more difficult. But because we do have a kind of theory of everyone, we have a deeper insight than we've ever had. We have a kind of periodic table for people. I think we're also, for the first time, able to tackle some of those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, you do have um, an inherently optimistic slash problem solving DNA in human history and maybe in human DNA, or at least in the human social organization, in that a lot of what you point out is this ability to learn and work collaboratively. There have been philosophers and evolutionary biologists and all who have pointed out that most of the particulars that human beings do, at least one of those things other animals do, but that almost that it's impossible to find an example of any other species that we are aware of currently on this
Right.
particular planet who are able to combine all of those into some lattice or framework, let alone a cognitive framework that allows for knowledge transmission, whether that's through writing or oral history, or I guess now whatever we call this digital
Right. Right.
transmission system, right? So I mean, that to me augurs for the ability to solve collective problems. I suppose a pushback would be it also augurs for our ability to magnify the problems that we create, right? So the two-edged sword part of it. Do you come out more on the, because we've collectively been able to come together more or less and solve the problems that we've created, that we are likely to continue to do so, or are you more agnostic about it could go either way?
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, it's like any financial advice you get: past results are no guarantee of future performance, right? So what I'm trying to do in the book is to say it's not sufficient to just say, "Hey, look, we've always been able to uh, technologically magic our way out of things." We need to understand how exactly that happened. Like, what are the levers of innovation, and why is it that if you look at just about any marker of progress, I like the way Ian Morris puts it: the Industrial Revolution makes a mockery of everything that came before. Like, it's an almost vertical takeoff in declines in violence, survival rates, lifespan, health, whatever you want. And the last time we saw a phase shift like that was the agricultural revolution. And so you need, if you want to say that we're always going to be able to make our way out of this, you need some kind of theory, some mechanism, some explanation for what happened in that moment, what happened in previous moments like that. And then you need to look at, those metrics and say, okay, well, what does that mean for our future? Is it going to be a situation? So, when the agricultural revolution was a major shift. The last one, I suppose, was fire, right? With fire, we were able to kind of pre-digest food, save the mechanical movement of our jaws, and shrink our guts and grow our brains. But after that, still as hunter gatherers, in terms of our populations, it was a one-to-one return on your time going out and hunting and gathering. With agriculture, we had a solar technology. So we switched from hunting and gathering to, if you like, harvesting and grinding, where you can grow things. It's far more efficient. And at first, that's great because you grow your populations, you push hunter gatherers to the margins, you've outcompeted them. But then eventually, abundance turns back to scarcity as your population size meets your new carrying capacity. And then agriculturalists start fighting with one another. And then you're in this Malthusian world where it's a zero sum world where your loss is my gain, wars of conquest, and this kind of flat line in terms of very, very slight increase, if anything, blips, if anything, in terms of progress until you hit the Industrial Revolution, where again you see this massive takeoff. And as I said, that's because you had joules upon joules of compressed, photosynthesis turned to chemical form and compressed into coal, oil, and natural gas. And so we've been in the rising phase for a long time, but that same pattern, that abundance eventually turns to scarcity as population size, carrying capacity catches up, is where we are now. And so if we this is what could go right. If we want to kind of reach that next level of abundance, it actually does require the next energy revolution. If you look at the numbers, so there's a particular metric that I want to share is energy return on investment from the energy sciences. So this tells you how much energy you get back from how much you put in. And in an ideal world, you want a kind of small, tiny energy sector of your economy, and a very large, all the other stuff the energy is buying you, the vacations, the food, the going out with your friends, all of that stuff. And so if you look at, for example, all the metrics look like this, but I'll give you like oil discovery rates, right? So in 1919, 1 barrel of oil found you another 1,000. By 1950, 1 barrel of oil found you another 100. And by 2010, 1 barrel of oil found you another 5. So in other words, our civilization, I mean, as a species, excess energy is shrinking. Like the literal amount, that excess stuff is decreasing, and that's what drives growth, right? That and the innovations with which we can, the things we can do with energy, those are the two things that drive growth. And so it's shrinking. And we had the nuclear age was kind of stillborn for a fear of, previous generations, and I think that would have kept us on that path, but we didn't invest, and now's the time to do it.
Jigar Shah, who now leads the Department of Energy's loan program for large scale infrastructure projects, particularly for new energy, who we had a conversation with. I think his perspective would be, and many people's, that we really aren't in a scarcity moment. We are, as you point out, we may have passed peak oil, but we certainly are producing enough, and also demand globally is going down. So there's that match as well, because the ability to substitute new sources of energy, some of which are renewable, some of which are still carbon based, has exceeded that particular scarcity abundance dynamic. So I do want to push back and ask, it may be true that in any one particular vertical, abundance is giving way to scarcity, but on an aggregate basis, whether that's human calories produced, whether that's energy of any form, hydro, nuclear, solar, coal, gas, we seem to be still outpacing whatever demands that we have globally.
Yeah, so we still have, my reading of the energy sciences is we still have plenty of energy at the moment, and if there's a decline, it's a decline in kind of the second derivative, right? It's that the rate of that, or the return, is what's decreasing. If you look at the energy return on investment numbers, not all the technologies look alike. So if you have, for example, hydropower, that's amazing. It's got nice returns. Something like solar, because the panels are getting cheaper and their lifespans are outstripping what we expected, they're great. You still have the battery problem, and you also have the problem that it requires an investment upfront that isn't paid off for quite some time, right? So as a society, you're using some amount of energy to get some amount of energy back in the future. Nuclear technologies, there's an issue because it depends on the size of what you're doing. I mean, I guess the overall point is, you got small modular reactors, you've got micro reactors. The big ones, we're not amazing at building them, but the Koreans seem to be doing a fine job. There are all these technologies that are available to us, but where we find ourselves in this particular moment is a slowdown. So there's plenty to go around, but when there's less available to us, so before every major recession in the last 50 years, there's been a spike in energy prices, or there's been a restriction in the amount of excess energy available to civilization. And those are the moments where you trigger people's kind of zero sum biases, because there's an economic slowdown, and it makes everything much more difficult. Like, it's easier to be nice when there's more to go around. In the book, I use this analogy of kind of buses coming along. So if you imagine kind of the amount of energy available to you is the rate of buses coming along, and there's buses coming every 5 minutes. There's still going to be mumblings and grumblings, right? So people are going to be upset that there's a 1% who always get their way to the front of the line, and they're going to be upset that some people let other members of their group to the front of the line. But it's just mumbling and grumbling as long as the buses are coming every 5 minutes. What we're seeing is a slight slowdown, so it's maybe every 10 minutes, every hour. But when that gets too slow, suddenly that mumbling and grumbling kind of breaks out into something more. It's like driving around a car park for a very long time, and someone takes that place, or how you're going to react depends on how many more spaces are available. So all of that makes it more difficult to engage in or invest in the technologies that are available to us today that will solve this crisis in the longer term. We face kind of a social cooperative breakdown in the shorter term whenever there's a shock on that. That's the argument that I make in the book. So it's a fundamentally optimistic book because these technologies do exist, and even more promising technologies, like nuclear fusion, for example, right? It's perpetually between Monday and 30 years away. We have for the first time some promising technologies and a startup ecosystem around that, and lots of investment in the private and public sector. That's exciting, and that would set us on a path that would, we'd be the first generation of a galactic civilization in terms of the excess energy.